All right. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining. Got a great show tonight, and I'm excited for a lot of reasons. We're going to get into some article reviews, and for those that are watching, first of all, make sure you hit the subscribe button. Remember that our goal here is to help everyone enter into a confirmed, confident, and eternal relationship with the source of all life and purpose. And in order to do that, we need to believe truth. It's pretty important. So before I go any further, my guest, Dr. Fazale Rana, can you just take a couple minutes and introduce yourself again?
Yeah, well, Alex, thanks again for having me on your show. And I think this is the second, maybe third time I've been on your show. So
Yeah.
Much appreciate that. It's good to see you again.
Yes, you too.
I'm a biochemist by training and am involved in Christian apologetics. I work for an organization called Reasons to Believe.
Mhm.
And the focus of our organization is to open up people to the gospel by revealing God in science. That's what we're about at Reasons to Believe. So we use apologetics as really a tool for helping people to see that a creator is real, that scripture, at least the creation accounts, are reliable, and that the rest of scripture likewise is trustworthy, with the hope that that helps to really build a bridge to the gospel for people. That's what we're about at Reasons to Believe. I've been with Reasons to Believe for 23 years, and so I've enjoyed every moment of being part of that organization.
It's been a blessing to get to know you all, and actually, I think Dr. Ross was on last week, actually. So everyone there I've talked to has been amazing, and so yeah, I appreciate the work that you all do for us laymen out here who are still trying to pronounce some of these words. So blessings to everybody joining in. What's up, Apologists in Detroit, Richly Redeemed, Rustlin Williams. We're going to start with our first article review. It's not a real happy article. Obviously, everyone at this point knows what happened in Buffalo this past weekend. And we're not going to, go into the social issues or theories or politics or any of those types of things. But I have a biochemist here, and somebody had actually sent me an article looking at the manifesto, this I forgot his name, Gendron wrote, and we tend to, I think the mainstream media is kind of talking about the replacement theory, and I guess it's a component, but how he got there by his own admission is surfing the web, really, and he kind of improperly taught himself some scientific information, and it resulted in tragedy. We want that to be the last type of that tragedy, or at least the last reason that somebody would engage in something like this, on faulty thinking. I want to be clear on that. It's not about a position of any other sort. So let me pull up the article, and then I want to pull out a couple things. Oops. There we go. All right. So how science fueled the white supremacist mass murderer in Buffalo, New York. I'm going to skip down to some of this. Okay. In his purported manifesto, the shooter asserts that blacks are a different subspecies of human. Why? Because whites and blacks are separated by tens of thousands of years of evolution, and our genetic material is obviously very different. All right. Elsewhere, he suggests that Europeans and Asians are more recently evolved than blacks, which sounds eerily reminiscent of the view of countless racists of the past, including Charles Darwin himself, that blacks are the lowest humans on the evolutionary ladder. There's a lot more he goes into that even other shooters had this kind of bad scientific impression that led them to their wrong belief that ended up killing caused them to kill a lot of people. So this is why bad ideas do matter. If we let's see, where was it? So there's this tendency, it says, toward racism was sort of a built into evolutionary theory from the get-go, because of how the theory sets up that if you're evolving from lower to higher, whatever comes lower or whatever comes first is thought to be inferior in some regards, or in many regards. So while most scientists have turned their backs on such racism, the misanthropic foundations of Darwinism have not been replaced. Today, the misanthropy usually shows itself not in the support of racism, but in the denial of value to all humans. So I'm going to pause there. And, Dr. Rana, when when I sent this to you, or even just your thoughts initially, what can you share with us?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of different directions we could go in terms of
Yeah.
how to react to this. And maybe I think the first thing to do is really present kind of a positive perspective on this whole issue of, racism that we see, sadly, here in the United States and other places around the world. And the bottom line is that there's no scientific justification in my mind for racism, regardless of one's worldview, because what we've learned, from the science of human origins, and again, this is irregardless of whether somebody holds to a Christian worldview, a materialistic worldview, but what we've learned scientifically is that the oldest people groups on the planet are African people groups.
Mm-hmm.
And so likely the very first humans would have been similar in appearance to, again, African people groups. And,
Mm-hmm.
Everybody on the planet, as I've heard said before, are Africans underneath our skin.
Mm-hmm.
We all come essentially from the same population, if you will. And it is true that as people began to migrate out of Africa into Asia, into Europe, and then ultimately into the Americas, there were microevolutionary changes that took place that created regional differences in humans.
Mm-hmm.
Most scientists would argue that while the genetic basis for those regional differences is significant, it's not substantial. In other words, it doesn't necessarily mean that one particular group is better than the other, or more evolved or more advanced than the other. It's just that these are microevolutionary differences that have been probably shaped by a combination of natural selection and what's called sexual selection, and even just genetic drift. And so the bottom line is that, genetically speaking, there is no substantial difference between anybody that's a modern human, an anatomically and behaviorally modern human, which is all of us.
Right.
There's really there really is no difference, whatsoever. And I think that's the really important point, that anybody who's trying to use genetic differences, to justify racism is simply not understanding what the science is indicating. Again, and what's interesting to me and exciting to me as a Christian is that this picture that the genetic variability that we of people around the world is informing us is, again, consistent with the biblical view that we have a singular origin in a single region, and that we all ultimately are, descendants of an Adam and an Eve. And so that biblical perspective is really very much in line with what the genetics indicates. So that's the first point that I really want to make is, and
Yeah.
something else that I think is worth noting too is that there's a growing number of anthropologists who are approaching the question of human origins from an evolutionary standpoint, who actually are beginning to argue that human beings are exceptional in that we stand apart from
It's
other
about
creatures.
time.
Yes, that we stand apart from other creatures, that there is a significant gap between humans and other creatures. And interestingly enough, the difference that they think, or the basis for that exceptionalism in humans is primarily our capacity to represent the world in symbols and then manipulate and combine and recombine those symbols. In other words, it's our capacity for language and music and art.
Mm-hmm.
And again, we're unique in that capacity. And when you look at the scientific descriptors of the qualities that make us, again, unique, you could argue that these descriptors seem to, align with the biblical idea of humans being made in God's image. You could see them as scientific descriptors for the image of God. So the bottom line is that somebody that holds to a biblical view of human origins and
Yeah.
human nature is not out of step with what science is indicating, even though that science is done within an evolutionary perspective. So if we're going to really look at the science and use the science to to guide us, the science is remarkably consistent with a biblical perspective on humans, right?
Yeah. Wow. That's awesome. And it's encouraging. And hopefully, people will pass this along, share this, not for my sake, but to prevent further loss of life off of ill logic. There's always going to be hate out there, but, facts matter. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, I think so let me ask a different question then. I have certain views on evolution. I know there's a theistic evolution lane, but given the framework of how the Darwinian model has to go, just because of how it's set up, is, like the article said, is this component, unbeknownst to those who propose this? Because I don't think most people who are Darwinian are racist. I'm not saying that, but is this something that you can't take away from Darwinism because of how it's structured? Is that?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a great question. And, one of the reasons I'm uncomfortable with the evolutionary paradigm, and particularly the idea of human evolution, is that if you really look at it look at the implications of human evolution, as John West points out in the article, it really undermines the value and the dignity that you would ascribe to human beings, or at least that's a reasonable, logical outworking of that idea. Because,
Yeah.
first of all, evolution is an unguided, undirected process.
Yeah.
It's a historically contingent process that utilizes existing designs and modifies them and cobbles together new designs. And so the inherent or the view is that organisms are inherently flawed because of our evolutionary history. That there's ultimately no directionality to evolution. That is, there's ultimately no meaning or purpose in evolutionary outcomes. Nothing is predetermined ahead of time. And if human beings are a product of an evolutionary history like every other life form on the planet, then there's nothing really that fundamentally distinguishes us from other creatures.
Mm-hmm.
So within that framework, it's very easy, I think, to develop the mindset that human life simply doesn't matter, that there's nothing sacred, there's nothing valuable, intrinsically good about human beings. We're just a part of this evolutionary network or this evolutionary tree of life.
Yeah.
And that we have no more or less value than any other creature on the planet. And so in the academy today, you hear people talking about speciesism, where to claim that humans are somehow exceptional is considered to be arrogant. And, and people, argue that humanity is a blight on planet Earth, that we've done damage to planet Earth, and that Earth would be better if humans disappeared. These are the kinds of ideas that are out there. So, it's very easy to see how that kind of thinking, can translate into a view that human life really doesn't have value. And then if that's the case, then, it's not surprising that we don't think twice about utilizing, human embryos for stem cell research, or, that we don't think twice about discarding human embryos or manipulating human embryos, for example, in scientific research. So, these are the logical outcomes. Now, it's also true too that, as John West points out, that in the very early days of evolutionary theory, when you saw the ideas of human evolution come to bear, part of the argument for human evolution was to look at the different people groups around the world and note that those people groups had differences. And the argument was that those differences were due to distinct evolutionary histories.
Mm.
Some people like Darwin, who held to monogenesis for humanity, argued that, similar to what this shooter argued, the shooter in Buffalo, New York
Mm.
argued, and that is, well, obviously white Europeans are much further up on the evolutionary scale. And for him, this actually justified British colonialism,
Mm.
uh, as an example. There are others, for example, like people like Carlton Kuhn, who in the 1930s suggested multi-regionalism, which is this idea that the different people groups around the world evolved independently from a primitive form over the
Mm.
span of 2 million years. And because there was a different evolutionary history, some people were, again, more advanced than others. And so there is this history of racism, if you will, that is within, human evolution. I mean,
Mhm.
today, I think, most people working in this area would soundly reject that racism of,
Yeah.
that's part of history, but nevertheless, it is there. And, you know, people can, that thinking, again, motivates, these white supremacist groups, sadly speaking, but it's a horrific misuse of the science.
Amen. Wow. Well said. As you were talking, I was thinking about a talk I gave for Reasons to Believe not too long ago. But I want to share this quote from Darwin himself. Actually, um, it kind of speaks to what you said, and he said, but then with me, the hard doubt arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of monkeys' minds if there are any convictions in such a mind? So, yeah, as he's proposing the theory, he's also knocking his own theory down,
Yeah.
uh, like you just said.
Yeah, yeah. Well, if you start talking about this idea that human beings are the product of evolution and that ultimately the human mind is the outworking of evolutionary processes, then really, and this is, I think, what Darwin was getting at is our minds are structured in such a way to promote survivability, not in such a way to discover what's true about the world. And if that's the case, then it really undermines you know, our capacity to know what is actually true. Could we
Mm.
just simply be misguided? And so if you start thinking about, again, the consequences of an evolutionary view of humanity, you really are in a situation where you could very well undermine the foundations of science itself.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, because you can't trust your mind, you can't trust the results from science, and yeah, can't even do science, I guess. Somebody had a question. I don't know if this is something you're prepared to answer or not, but those who say that we couldn't have come from Africans because Adam and Eve weren't from Africa, but I believe, because we got to think about Mesopotamia, Pangea. So, I mean, not Africa as it is today, but it's the same area, right?
Yeah, well, I take the Garden of Eden as being a particular location
Yeah.
when I read scripture. And we have four rivers that kind of give the boundaries for the Garden of Eden.
Hmm.
And the identity of two of the rivers isn't known. The Pishon and the Gihon River are not known. Some people have suggested that these rivers may be making reference to the Nile River.
Mm.
There's reference to the land of Cush with respect to part of the geography of Eden,
Right.
Garden of Eden, and that in the Old Testament is in reference to Ethiopia.
Hmm.
So the Garden of Eden actually could have very well encompassed, parts of Africa,
Hmm.
right? So it wasn't just simply confined necessarily to Mesopotamia. So, it's quite possible that, again, that difference that on the surface seems to be create an incompatibility between the biblical text and the scientific data may actually not be as substantive of a problem as it might appear on the surface.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's great. Well said. All right. Well, I hope everyone took something away, and if there's anyone, you probably don't know anyone, but if there's anyone you think needs to just be aware of the scientific evidence, like I said, we're just trying to debunk the notions or the false ideas that got this shooter to do what he did, and others, and many others in the past too. So, and actually, even we can go back to Hitler, that he had some of these beliefs. So, let's move to the second article. And wait, where is the second? Here we go. So the article says we have even more evidence life's building blocks came to Earth from space. So we can all see where this is going. This is still trying to figure out how we got here, and we know it wasn't God, so we got to figure out some other answer, right? So they're looking in these meteorites, and talk about the DNA and the RNA, and I'll have you unpack that and why we need both. And if I'm not mistaken, we need this is a constant or a necessary condition, right? You need both from the start, right? DNA and RNA.
Yeah, well,
or ribosomes to get there.
Yeah, there's something that origin of life researchers are confronted with, and this is called the chicken and egg paradox. And the idea here is that, people would say, well, DNA is a self-replicating molecule. It is and it isn't. Because in order for DNA to replicate, there has to be an ensemble of distinct proteins that are essentially replicating the DNA.
Right.
And so, and of course, DNA contains the information to make proteins. So there's this interdependence on DNA and proteins. And so one of the conundrums that origin of life researchers face is, what came first, right? DNA or proteins. And this is called the chicken and egg paradox.
Mm-hmm.
And the way in which this has been resolved by origin of life researchers is to speculate that maybe the very first biochemistry wasn't based on DNA and proteins, but exclusively on RNA molecules. And so they call this the RNA world. And so, but either, in that scenario, you would still need to have these nucleobases that these researchers found in these meteorites, these 3 different meteorites. So for the origin of life, whether you see it, DNA and proteins emerging first or just RNA emerging first, you still need, the 4 nucleobases.
Gotcha. So, I mean, I don't know if this is an RNA world, quote unquote, a possibility. Is that a realistic possibility?
Well, let's put it this way. I mean, the RNA world hypothesis is riddled with problems. Some of them seemingly intractable, and we could go through a long, exhaustive list of some of those problems if you're so inclined. But the bottom line is that most people recognize that origin of life researchers some of the very serious issues with the RNA world model. But because of the chicken and egg paradox, most origin of life researchers would argue that the origin of life had to proceed through something like an RNA world. That's the only way to get away from the chicken and egg paradox. And so it's a necessary evil, if you will, if you're an origin of life researcher. And it's not to say that it's not without, some evidence, but the bottom line is that the problems, with, the RNA world are legion and well documented and well acknowledged by origin of life researchers.
Okay. Well, yeah, I actually I did a video called The Chicken and Egg, and it was a snippet, and I was looking at, I think, what book was I reading? But it was talking about how it would take, to get one functional protein molecule, if you just let carbon react in the universe for, I think it was like a billion years, and allowed, and even if you put it in a certain environment where it was going to actually hit something at one point, the chances of getting one functional protein molecule was 1 in 10 to the 60th, which is a number that's so astronomical you can't even write it out. And so, but one protein molecule, as you would know, is not life. You need probably
Right.
200 or something to get a small living organism.
Right.
So you have to get this really, really unimaginably random, rare thing to happen, not once,
Right.
but millions of times, and in the right order, because the bases have to line up the right way. And like, so maybe can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, I mean, another way to think about this is work done by, original life researchers looking for what is the minimum complexity for life.
Hmm.
There's a number of ways that people have tackled the problem, but the bottom line is that in order for life to exist as a bona fide life form, you have to have, number one, uh, genetic material. You have to have DNA and the machinery that would replicate DNA. You have to have the ability to make proteins. You have to have some capacity to extract energy from the environment and some way to build, a cell envelope that would encapsulate the cell. And that minimally is going to require on the order of several hundred different proteins that are working collaboratively to achieve this, which means that the minimum genome size is on the order of 400 or so gene products. And so to your point, just getting a single protein isn't going to do anybody any good.
Hmm.
Even if you happen to come upon a protein that has biological function, that function only operates is only meaningful in the context of the overall cellular chemistry that's taking place.
Gotcha.
In isolation, you know, proteins that are functional are really of no good to anything. So there's this, inherent irreducible complexity to life itself.
Yeah.
And so, how do you achieve something like that is really challenging. The only way to do it is in a stepwise fashion where hopefully you have some kind of intermediate forms that are persistent, and are able to actually reproduce and
Hmm.
undergo, change, through that reproductive process, that they're able to evolve. And, nobody at this point has really produced any kind of scenario for how something like that would happen.
Yeah. And that's that's what I think is so interesting. When we even in school, there's science classes, and we teach all these things that, or even in popular culture, what most people believe about life and science. And I think most people are under the impression that everything is pretty much figured out, except for a couple things.
Yeah.
But the basic things are not figured out. They're not even close to figured out.
Yeah.
Like, origin of life is the origin. It's the beginning, and no one has a clue except unless you believe in God. So
Yeah.
it's just baffling sometimes. I'm sure you get it worse than I do, that you hear people talk so matter of fact about things, and no, it's not as tightly knit as you think it
Yeah.
is.
Yeah. And that I mean, the origin of life problem is part of the reason why I became a Christian. I was
Mm,
going into graduate school. I was an agnostic and,
mm,
bought into the evolutionary paradigm. And as I was studying biochemistry, became very quickly impressed with the complexity and the elegance and the sophistication, the ingenuity of biochemical systems, and began to ask questions to the effect of, how is it that these systems came, to be? And that's the origin of life problem.
mhm,
As a graduate student, I began to study different models for the origin of life and very quickly came to the conviction that there's no way that these kind of processes could produce the types of chemical systems we see in the cell.
mm,
At that point, it's like there has to be a mind or an intelligent agent that undergirds the origin of life.
mm,
But as soon as I arrived at that conclusion, I was essentially making a very sharp departure from mainstream scientific thinking.
mm.
And when we think about science, we tend to think about the operation of science as being highly objective, but it actually isn't. I mean, there's a philosophical framework that undergirds science itself, and
Right.
that framework is known as methodological naturalism, which is you know a concept. The term sounds foreboding, but the concept is simple, and that is when you approach scientific investigations, you're always going to look for mechanistic answers.
Mm.
You know, you're going to look for materialistic answers to problems. And so you exclude any kind of appeal to the supernatural before you
Right.
even begin the investigation.
Right.
Well, the net effect of that is then, of course, the origin of life has to have emerged through chemical evolution.
Right.
You philosophically, you forced yourself into that position. Yet, every attempt to try to explain the origin of life, as you point out, just winds up with failure. It winds up at a dead end.
Mm. Wow. Well said. It's just a lot of stuff I say, but I'm not a biochemist, so I'm glad I got it right. I want to read a couple quotes from the article just for everybody. Said experiments that had simulated the contents of space materials that suggested the presence of various nucleobases out there in quotes, suggesting that these classes of organic compounds are ubiquitously present in extraterrestrial environments, both inside and outside the solar system, the team writes. That sounds like special pleading to me. Like, how do you shouldn't be able just to say that without the evidence behind it. And even in the article, they don't outline evidence behind that statement.
Well, so what's going on there is that these meteorites, the Murchison, the Murray, the Lake Tagish meteorites, are what are called carbonaceous chondrites, and this is a particular class of meteorites that are rich in carbon and are believed to be remnants of when the solar system formed. So these meteorites date, around 4.5 billion years in age, which is, again, that they would be among the oldest materials in the universe, or sorry, not the universe, check that, the solar system. And so people study these meteorites as a way to try to gain insight as to what was happening, in terms of the chemistry of the early solar system. And
right.
And so, when these meteorites hit the Earth, there's, always concern that they're going to be picking up materials from the Earth's environment. And so the concern is that when you analyze the chemical makeup of the carbon components of these meteorites, are you picking up terrestrial contamination?
Mm.
And so, but in this particular study, they did a number of things to convince themselves that the results that they were seeing reflected in endogenous material in the meteorites, not stuff picked up from the Earth environment. And so because they're seeing at very, very low levels, guanine and adenine and cytosine and thymine and uracil and other what are called purine and pyrimidine analogs, they argue that these things must have either formed in the meteorite once from materials that would have been available in the early solar system, or maybe these materials already existed in the solar nebula that collapsed to form, our solar system, and so that they may be simply, endogenous to the solar system itself. So that's how the reasoning goes behind that. It's because of it's really it's not demonstrated to be true, but the evidence suggests that that's a possibility. And then people, of course, are hoping that, because the number of impact events that the Earth was experienced early on was very high, that maybe you could have actually had these materials delivered to the Earth, and that the prebiotic inventory of the Earth could have been built up from, delivery from asteroids, meteorites. Well, meteorites are portions of asteroids, and comets, the cometary delivery as well. So that's what the thinking is. But the amounts of material that would be delivered to the Earth, even if you had very heavy, numbers of impact events, it's still going to be trace amounts. It's going to be relatively low levels that I don't think would have really made much difference for the origin of life.
Interesting. I think it's also interesting that there's something they're giving away, which is good. That the evidence for the intricacy, the irreducible complexity of DNA and of humans and the other life forms too, really, is so obviously designed that they're almost ceding that position, right? And they're just saying, we don't believe God designed it, but we know that this didn't just happen by accident, so we got to look for another designer out there. And yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to your point, the fact that you're appealing to, you know, you know, extraterrestrial delivery of these prebiotic materials is really, an indication that we don't know how these materials would have been generated on the early Earth to begin with, right? And so that is an implicit admission, in this particular study.
Yeah.
Right. And even if you did happen to have nucleobases that were available on the early Earth, that's not enough. You've got to have a pathway to assemble them into, RNA building blocks, into what are called nucleotides or ribonucleotides. And that's a significant problem confronting, origin of life models, is how do you get ribose and the nucleobases and phosphate to react under the conditions of the early Earth to form, ribonucleotides, which is necessary to get RNA molecules. So,
yeah, no, it just makes the problem a little stickier, right? And even if let's say there was a whole alien in one of these meteorites, right? Even if that were the case, it still doesn't answer the question. Right. It just pushes it one step farther back. We're still trying to find the beginning of everything. Right. And so even to say multiverse or say meteors or whatever it is, it's still not answering the question. Right. I guess they'll say it's getting us closer. Right.
Yeah. Well, that's the problem when you start to appeal to, the idea is called panspermia, that life was delivered to Earth. Maybe life originated in another location, like on the surface of Mars, and was transported to Earth, or maybe it came, into our solar system from an interstellar source. And as you're pointing out, you're just pushing the problem downfield. You're not really solving the problem.
Yeah. Great. All right. Number 3. Is this 3? Yeah. This would be the probability of life on Jupiter's moon Europa just got a lot higher. I'm actually going to read a couple quotes for you. Such microbial life has been theorized to have existed in the early days of Mars, like you said, before its water dried up, though we still don't know for certain. He says the subject of curiosity is the giant ridges that crisscross the planet's surface, and it's talking about Jupiter now, like scratches on a cue ball. Underneath those ridges, explain the authors of a new paper in the journal Nature Communications, there may be pools of salty liquid water, and since those ridges are ubiquitous, that means the pools could also be commonplace. There's a lot of coulds in here. Let's see. Let me go a little further down. It says Chiba echoed this view when he wrote that it is possible, based on what we know so far, to imagine types of microorganisms that could live in Europa. So Europa is the moon of Jupiter, Europa's ocean. There was the important caveat, though, that we are dealing with the truly alien. We cannot know for sure that life can only develop as it has on Earth, because we do not fully understand what causes life to exist in the first place, which is what we were just talking about. We don't know if there is life there or not, because we don't have enough of an understanding of the origin of life. This is a direct quote from the article, by the way. It says, we don't know if there is life on Earth or not, because we don't have enough understanding of the origin of life on Earth or anywhere else to say whether Europa's conditions would have favored the origin of life, end quote. So I don't even know. Like, they kind of took everything away that they gave us in the article. Just speculation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what you see here going on is recognizing that if you're going to have life, you have to have liquid water. That's the first criteria for life. And so what NASA is doing, and this makes a lot of sense, is that they're looking for locations where there would have been liquid water at some point, in that planet or moon's history, or there's a liquid water today. And so people think that in the early days of Mars was liquid water, which is why people again speculate maybe life could have originated on Mars.
Yeah.
Europa is this Jovian moon, and it has a very thick ice sheet on its surface, maybe 100 kilometers deep. It's believed that there's liquid water underneath that, and then there's a rocky material, and then I think perhaps even a metal core. And so because of the gravitational heat, the gravitational energy as it orbits a very large planet like Jupiter, there's enough heating and activity that people think you have the energy that you would need for life to originate potentially, or at least exist in the liquid waters of Europa. And so, but nobody knows again if there is indeed liquid water underneath the ice sheets of Europa's surface. So this is a very interesting study where these researchers went to Greenland, and they noticed that there are these double ridge features in Greenland that you also observe on the surface of Europa. And they recognize that in order for those double ridge features to form in Greenland, there has to be liquid water underneath the ice sheets. And so therefore they argue that there's liquid water underneath the ice sheets of Europa. And so that's, the hope that they have is because there's potentially liquid water again on Europa, maybe life originated there, maybe life exists there. But, I think it's an interesting approach to gain insight into this, again, what the surface of Europa might look like. But, you're assuming that the mechanisms that form this, double ridge system in Greenland actually would be in play on Europa, and there's no evidence necessarily that those mechanisms are the same. So it's an interesting study. It's highly speculative at best.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking as I was reading it. I mean, even I don't think you have to understand everything in the article just to see, well, this could be, or that might be, or we don't know, or like it's just like, all right, well, get back to me when you know. All right, let's go to number 4. And this one's interesting. So the article says, like fingerprints at a crime scene, study finds new clues about causes of cancer. I actually, I thought this was a good use of science, really. In a way, I know we kind of banged on some other articles and things like that, and I'm sure there's other things in here that I'm not seeing, but in some degrees, I think using science to cure diseases and cancer, and we just had a pandemic. I mean, I think that's a good use of it. What do you think? What did you think when you read the article?
Yeah, I thought it was an interesting article that really is beginning to show us the benefits of having the human genome sequence, and the benefits of the work that's been done to really make sequencing of the entire genomes of humans cost effective. It's remarkable in the study. I think there was like 12,000 participants when I read the science paper. 12,000 participants, and they sequenced the genomes of all of them, and then they were able to use computational power of today's computers to be able to look for patterns, and they identified, I think, 58 type of signatures.
Quotes right here, real quick. I'll read it. It says, with thousands of mutations per cancer, we have unprecedented power to look for commonalities and differences across NHS patients. And in doing so, we have uncovered 58 new mutational signatures and broadened our knowledge of cancer. And so can you explain? So is this kind of like we both have cancer, but I have a little different flavor than yours,
Yeah, that's exactly right. So because you have that massive amount of data, then you can say, well, here are these patients with cancer. This is the type of cancer they have. And then if you notice that people with particular types of cancer have certain genetic mutations or certain genetic, mutational, fingerprints seem to be contributing to the same type of cancer, then it would suggest that there might be, different the cancers are different, or that there might be different mechanisms that are causing, the same type of cancer. And so that actually gives you, greater degree of understanding of the nuances of a cancer diagnosis, and it maybe suggests different ways that you might go about treating cancer based on the genetic fingerprint, that is associated with that cancer, where certain cancer therapies are going to be more effective against some types of cancers as opposed to others, or certain therapies might be more effective at certain mutational signatures for a particular cancer compared to others. So this is a really important breakthrough that's going to allow, I think, just a much more sophisticated approach to treating cancer and a much more personalized approach.
Yeah, no, that's really great. And I think I love science. Obviously, you're a scientist, so I want people to hear us that it's not, obviously you're not talking against science. You're a scientist, but I think sometimes people can they hear a Christian talking about science, and so they'll think, especially with me not being a scientist, oh, you're just trying to make the evidence fit what you want to believe. And it's actually the opposite that's true. And so some of these articles, as we've gone through, it seems to be, I mean, from the shooter, he's made the science. Well, he didn't make the science fit. He misunderstood the science, but then made it fit what he was already kind of geared towards believing. If you're geared towards there is no supernatural, you will look for extraterrestrial life until you're blue in the face. Like you just won't entertain God in your paradigm. But if that's the right answer to the question on the test, then you'll never get the right answer to the question on the test. So we're trying to just provide other avenues and do it at a scholarly level with Dr. Rana, so that everyone can understand that, number one, science and Christianity have no disagreement, but that wasn't really the point tonight, but more to the point of how do we understand these things that come through media or happen in pop culture? How do we understand those things properly, biblically, and accurately? Because faulty ideas have real world consequences. They don't stay in people's heads. It spills out. And when it spills out and it's a really bad idea, like the Buffalo shooters ideas, a lot of people get hurt.
Yeah.
So thank you, Dr. Rana. Once again, I'm sure you'll be back again. There's never a shortage of material, right?
No, there's not, which is good and bad, I guess.
Yeah, that's true. All right. Well, until next time, peace.